happens when there's an increase in just one of these autonomous variables, investment spending. Now this causes the aggregate spending curve to shift upwards, and a new equilibrium position is established at point E1, with a new equilibrium level of output Y1. The important thing to notice here is that the increase in investment spending brings about a much larger increase in output and income. If the increase in investment spending is 100 million rand, the increase in output and income will be considerably more than that. This is the work of the multiplier effect, an amazing force that can generate huge income from just a modest injection of funds. We're going to see if the circular flow model can help shed some light on this magic. We'll start off by assuming that a company has decided to build a new factory for 100 million rand. Investment spending and total spending in the economy rises by 100 million rand. The business employs various factors of production to build the factory, and since these factors are owned by households, their income increases by 100 million rand. Now that investment was an injection into the economy, increasing the level of output and income. But that's not the end of it, and this is where the mysterious multiplier kicks in. As household income rises, households tend to increase their consumption spending. Some new clothes, a plasma TV, a meal out, and so on. Now how much they increase their consumption spending by depends on their marginal propensity to consume. We're going to assume that it's 0.8, so consumption spending grows by 80 million rand, 80% of the initial 100 million rand injection. What happens to the rest of their income, the other 20 million rand? Well, what's not spent is usually saved, so savings increased by 20 million rand. This brings us to the conservative sister of that rash marginal propensity to consume, the marginal propensity to save. In this case, it's 0.2. From every 1 rand rise in income, households will save 20 cents. So while investment is seen as an injection into the circular flow of income, savings represent a leakage from the circular flow. Getting back to consumption though, as households increase their spending, the rise in demand prompts firms to increase production by the same amount, 80 million rand, which becomes another 80 million rand increase in income for the households employed by those firms. Okay, hold on. What's happened so far? Well, at this point, the 100 million rand increase in investment spending has caused total spending to rise by 180 million rand. We have the new 100 million rand factory, the building of which generated 100 million rand of additional income for the households involved in building it. They in turn went out and spent 80 million rand of that. Now this pleased the firms in the economy. Demand's up again, and they duly increased production by a further 80 million rand. Okay, so what next? Well, this last increase in production means a rise in income. Households earn another 80 million rand and they're going to spend it. Well, not all of it, 80% of it. So consumption spending increases by 64 million rand. The remaining 20%, the 16 million rand, goes into savings. Now, back to those firms who've just picked up 64 million rands worth of sales. It's a good sign, demand's still rising. They increase production to keep up with demand, and in doing so generate income of 64 million rand for their owners and employees. Once again, these households rush out and spend most of it, 80% in fact, so consumption spending rises again by 51.2 million rand. The other 12.8 million rand went into savings. Firms must again try to keep up with demand, and they increase output by 51.2 million rand and generating income for their employees and owners. And so it continues. This is the multiplier effect. This round after round of further consumption spending is the indirect result of one initial increase in investment spending. So, does this multiplier effect continue indefinitely? The answer, unfortunately, is no. The reason is that the induced spending, that is, the changing consumption spending caused by an increase in income, is getting smaller and smaller with each cycle, because households only spend a portion of their increase in income. The rest, they save. This savings represents a leakage from our circular flow model, and the leakage rate is 20%. All right, keep this image of how the multiplier works in your mind. we're going to see how it translates to our goods market diagram. An increase in autonomous spending, like that initial increase in investment, causes a parallel upward shift of the total spending curve, a shift equal to the increase in investment. The vertical intercept goes up by 100 million rand. At the original level of income, Y0, total spending now exceeds the level of output by that much. But this investment translates into income for those involved in building it. This increase in income prompts households to increase their consumption spending. Output rises to keep up with demand. This moves up to point B. Total spending still exceeds the equilibrium level of income and output, but the gap is smaller, as indicated by the vertical distance between point B and the 45-degree line. As long as total spending exceeds the level of output, firms will keep increasing production. The income of households will keep rising, and so will their consumption spending. This process will continue until a new equilibrium is reached where total spending is equal to the level of output. This occurs at point E1, with an equilibrium level of income and output Y1. Comparing point E with E1, it's clear that the increase in the equilibrium level of income and output is much greater than the initial investment. By how much the equilibrium level of income changes depends on the value of the marginal propensity to consume, small c, so it's this that determines the value of the multiplier. According to our equilibrium formula, the multiplier effect is equal to 1 divided by 1 minus c. Given a propensity to consume of 0.8, the multiplier is 1 over 1 minus 0.8, which is 1 divided by 0.2, which equals 5. For every 1 rand increase in autonomous spending, the equilibrium level of income increases by 5 rand. The change in our equilibrium level of income is therefore the multiplier times the change in investment, I. In our case, 100 million rand rise in investment increases the equilibrium level of output and income by 500 million rand. Now, back in our circular flow model, the impact of the multiplier can be shown like this. The increase in total spending is equal to the initial investment spend, 100 million rand, plus the change in induced consumption spending, which in the end amounted to 400 million rand. The level of production and income increased by the same amount as the change in total spending, 500 million rand. But there's something else, the change in savings. If income increases by 500 million rand, but consumption spending rises by only 400 million rand, 80%, the remaining 100 million, or 20%, went into savings. The interesting thing here is that the increase in savings exactly matches the original investment spend, indicating that investment spending has created its own savings. So we've looked pretty extensively at the impact of changes in autonomous spending. But what about a change in the marginal propensity to consume? Well, with everything we've picked up so far on our trip through the goods market, we actually already have the tools we need to explain this. We established earlier that the marginal propensity to consume dictates the slope or angle of the aggregate spending curve. So it's not too complicated. A change in our propensity to consume will cause a change in the slope of the total spending curve. An increase in our marginal propensity to consume, C, from say 0.8 to 0.9 will give us a multiplier of 1 over 1 minus C, so 1 over 0.1, which gives us a multiplier of 10. For every 1 rand increase in autonomous spending, the equilibrium level of output and income now goes up by 10 rand, double the 5 rand increase of before. And 100 million rand investment will result in a 1 billion rand rise in the equilibrium level of output and income. As our marginal propensity to consume rises, the slope of the total spending curve gets steeper, moving closer and closer to the 45-degree line. The rise in the multiplier accelerates. A slight increase in our spending pattern leads to a huge increase in the multiplier. A marginal propensity of 0.95, for instance, yields a multiplier of 20. Now, what you need to take with you from this section is 1. That a change in autonomous spending, such as investment spending, has a multiplier effect on the equilibrium level of income. A rise in autonomous spending results in a much larger increase in output and income. And 2, a single decrease in autonomous spending causes a much greater drop in output and income. Thirdly, the value of the multiplier is determined by the marginal propensity to consume. The higher our marginal propensity to consume, the greater the multiplier.
Let's summarise what we know so far. In our goods market model, total spending, that's A, determines the level of output and income, Y. An equilibrium exists in the goods market when Y equals A.
We know total or aggregate spending, A, is all spending in the economy, consumption spending, C, plus investment spending, I. We know that the consumption spending part of this includes autonomous consumption, C bar, that level of consumption that's independent of income. And it also includes induced consumption, the product of C, our marginal propensity to consume, multiplied by our income. Investment spending, I, is all independent from any level of output, so it's just I bar.
And so our spending function is therefore aggregate or total spending is equal to autonomous spending plus our marginal propensity to consume multiplied by our income. So A equals A bar plus C times Y. And from this, our equilibrium formula is Y equals 1 over 1 minus C times A bar. And then we learned how to show this graphically. The total spending curve is upward sloping from left to right, indicating that it is a positive function of the level of output and income. The slope or angle of the curve is determined by the marginal propensity to consume. And its vertical intercept, which is the point where the curve starts, is determined by autonomous spending, that's A bar, which is autonomous consumption, C bar, plus investment spending, I. The 45-degree line you see here indicates possible equilibrium positions. Now, equilibrium in the goods market occurs where the level of output and income, Y, is equal to total spending, A, and this occurs at point E. However, while point E is an equilibrium position, it's not necessarily the level of full employment. At this equilibrium position, there could be unemployment in the market. Now, this is important. In this model, there are forces to ensure equilibrium, but not necessarily full employment. The economy can get stuck in a position of less than full employment. Let's assume that the level of full employment is indicated by the vertical line, YF, which is to the right of our equilibrium position. Now, this indicates that there's unemployment in this economy. And this leads to the first really important question. What should happen in the goods market to decrease unemployment, or, ideally, to reach full employment?
Well, the level of production is determined by total spending, right? So, to create employment, the economy must somehow achieve an increase in total spending. Now, how can this be done? We'll have to find a way to increase one or more of the spending components. Autonomous consumption, investment, or society's marginal propensity to consume.
Using this diagram, let's try to show how an increase in investment spending will lead to full employment.
An increase in investment will shift the total spending curve upwards, and if it's a big enough injection, with the help from the multiplier effect, we might be lucky enough to reach point E1, where equilibrium in the market now takes place at the level of full employment. Comparing YE to YF, we know that the change in income is far greater than the amount of that initial investment, again, thanks to the multiplier. Comparing point E with E1, we know that consumption spending by households has increased several times.
Now, next question. How do savings change between point E and E1? Well, savings are now higher. In fact, the increase in savings exactly matches the rise in investment. But why are savings higher? In this model, savings are a function of the level of income, and as income increases, so does savings.
In this model, the act of investment creates its own savings. It's possible to interpret this as a sign that we should be more concerned with investment than with savings, since savings are a leakage from the flow of income. Well, this is an old, unresolved debate in economics. Does savings drive investment, or does investment create its own savings? The pragmatic approach would be to say that both have their place.
Now, how would we show an increase in the marginal propensity to consume?
An increase in the marginal propensity to consume increases the slope of the total spending curve, and at every level of output and income, the level of consumption spending is higher. In other words, the multiplier effect is now greater.
Now, the last question is a little tricky, but if you can answer it, you're well on your way to understanding how the goods market operates. Here it is. Using the goods market model, try to show that if households decide to increase their marginal propensity to save, the level of savings in the whole economy actually decreases.
Figured it out? Well, let's work through it. An increase in the marginal propensity to save means our marginal propensity to consume is lower. In turn, this means that households consume a lower proportion of their income. This is, in effect, lower demand, and firms react by decreasing production. This fall in output means a further drop in income, leading both to less money to spend and less to save.
Now, in terms of our diagram, this is indicated by a flatter total spending curve. This is referred to as the paradox of thrift. Your dictionary might define thrift as a tendency to refrain from spending, or to be conservative when spending. The paradox of thrift indicates that if households start to save more of their income, total spending drops, which causes production or output to fall, employing less of our factors of production, so income drops. And with a lower income, we have less to save. Intriguing, isn't it? I'm off to find out what happens when we introduce government to our model. See you there. In our simple Keynesian models so far, we've looked at the level of output and income, and we've seen how it's determined by total spending. We've also indicated that equilibrium in the goods market is reached when the level of output and income is equal to total spending. However, we also saw that this equilibrium position is not necessarily at the level of full employment.
The goods market can get stuck at an equilibrium position that's below the level of full employment. There are forces present in the goods market that ensure that an equilibrium between buyers and sellers is always reached, but there are no such natural market forces guaranteeing full employment. Now, if the economy is stuck in that sort of position, it seems logical that the economy must try to increase output to create more employment. More production requires more labour. Now, in this model, we know that an increase in output can only be brought about by an increase in total spending. To increase production, increased spending has to come from somewhere. If total spending consists of consumption spending and investment spending, then an increase in one or both of these should trigger more production. So it's simple in theory, but just how do we achieve this in the real world? Let's go back in history. It's the 1930s. The Great Depression has decimated world economies. Output is falling, wages are falling, and mass unemployment is everywhere. These were hard times. Money was short, and consumption spending plummeted to record lows, causing further declines in total spending. There seemed to be no way out of this spiral of shrinking output, falling incomes, lower spending, and rising unemployment. Investment spending, one of the factors that can boost an economy, wasn't looking healthy either. With investment driven by the expectations of entrepreneurs, the number of bankruptcies, the low rates of return, and the massive uncertainty in the market all work to shatter investor confidence in the market. Investors suspend their plans until things improve. They cannot or will not inject enough money to rescue spending, output, and income.
The solution, according to Mr. Keynes, is for the government to step in and make use of its spending and taxation powers to influence the level of spending, and therefore the level of production in the economy. So, how does the government do this? How can it influence total spending and the level of output and income in the goods market? To find out, we must consider the impact of government spending and taxation on total spending, on the multiplier, and on the level of output and income.
We asked people how government spending and taxation affected them.
Dus is allemaal sê die belasting is 'n bietjie kwaai.
I can hardly save about 500 rand a month. I can hardly save.
Both my kids are at school-going age, and the type of schools that they're at, it's not like they get supplied with all the textbooks and things like that, and we have to buy all the textbooks, all the uniforms. The school fees keep going up as well, just to keep them in a mildly respectable, educational environment.
Die belasting, ek verstaan nie. Ons kry niks nie. Wat baat er met betaal belasting, maar ons kry niks nie. Ek kry niks van government af nie. Niks.
Ek kry
Government kan nie wag om op kontrak werk nie. Van môre is daar nie werk meer vir ons nie. Om vir ons permanent te maak vir die job wat ons nou het. En meer geld aan te bied.
Next government. Ons soek job nou, next job.
We'll start by using our circular flow diagram to demonstrate the impact of government spending on total spending and income and output.
The government, as we saw in the budget, spends on everything from roads and power stations to schools and healthcare. In our circular flow diagram, government spending must clearly be included as part of total spending in the economy. So our total spending equation is actually consumption spending plus investment spending plus government spending. As the government orders more goods and services, firms respond by increasing output to meet this need. So the level of production rises. So more factors of production are employed, so household income increases, which in turn leads to higher consumption spending, sparking even more production, even higher incomes, and further spending. The multiplier process is taking effect.
Government spending is therefore an injection into the circular flow of spending, output, and income. An increase in government spending stimulates total spending, and therefore production and income in the economy increases. On the flip side, a drop in government spending decreases total spending in the economy, and production and income decline. But what about taxation?
In any liberal democracy or democratic society, the state has an authority to govern over a body of citizens, and in order to provide essential services and infrastructure for a population or a society to function, a government or a government structure would need some form of revenue.
I'm sure that those of you who earn a salary or wages will have noticed that the amount you earn and the amount you have available for spending are not always the same. This is because most of us have first to pay a sizable chunk of our income to the government in the form of income tax. For most of us, consumption spending is based on our income after taxation, otherwise known as our disposable income.
Let's put income tax into our circular flow model to see how it influences total spending and the level of output and income. In order to understand this more easily, we'll assume a simple income tax system with a proportional tax, say of 25% of household income for all households. Now, in the real world, countries are more likely to have a more complex, progressive income tax system, where the tax rate increases as income increases. But just to start with, we'll assume this simple, flat rate.
In our model, part of all the income paid out by firms now flows to the government in the form of income tax, with the rest flowing on to households as disposable income. They now have less income for consumption, so total spending therefore decreases.
Income tax therefore represents a leakage from the circular flow. A rise in income tax causes a decrease in total spending, output and income, and a drop in income tax stimulates spending, output and income. So, how does the introduction of government into our circular flow impact on our goods market model? Well, let's look first at government spending. To start with, we're going to assume, I know, again, that government spending is independent of the level of output. It's another autonomous variable, not influenced by the level of output.
So G equals G bar. Output and income have no influence on how much is spent by the government. On our graph, it's represented as a horizontal curve, a level of spending that stays the same across all levels of output and income. An increase in government spending causes an upward shift of the government spending curve. Our total spending equation, representing all expenditure in the economy, now evolves to include government spending. Aggregate spending A now equals C plus I plus G. All our autonomous components of this C bar plus I bar plus G bar give us the vertical intercept, A bar. So A bar, the vertical intercept, now moves up by the amount of government spending. And it follows that the entire total spending curve shifts upwards from A1 to A2. Now, what's happened to the equilibrium level of income?
Well, it turns out that the increase in income is greater than the additional government spending, and this is thanks to the multiplier effect in this model. As the levels of production and income increase in the economy, households increase their consumption spending. So the rise in income is therefore equal to the change in government spending multiplied by the multiplier.
So government can stimulate the economy by increasing its expenditure, but what one hand giveth, the other taketh away. Let's see what the introduction of taxation does to our goods market model. Okay, looking back at our consumption function, consumption spending equals autonomous consumption, C bar, plus our marginal propensity to consume times our income, CY. Tax reduces our income. So in our equation, income Y becomes brackets 1 minus T close brackets, representing tax, times Y. 1 minus T times Y is our income after tax, or our disposable income. We now have less for consumption spending.
Now, graphically, this is indicated by a change in the slope of the consumption curve. At every level of output and income, less is now being spent on consumption, so the curve tilts downwards and becomes flatter. The autonomous part of spending is unchanged, so the vertical intercept does not change either.
Now this must have an effect on all spending in the economy, and sure enough, the total or aggregate spending curve is also flatter. Note again, income tax does not affect autonomous spending. It only affects spending dependent on income. Our total spending, A, now equals autonomous spending plus our marginal propensity to consume multiplied by our income less tax. So A equals A bar plus C times 1 minus T times Y. In the graph, the effect of income tax is to reduce income from Y2 to Y1 out of disposable income. An equilibrium output moves from point E2 back to E1 because the reduced consumption spending will cause a drop in production.
Getting back to the multiplier effect for a moment. It's determined by the behaviour of households and their marginal propensity to consume. Before we included an income tax, if we assumed a marginal propensity to consume of 0.8, an increase of 100 in autonomous spending would lead to a rise of 100 in output and income, followed by an increase of 80 in consumption spending.
Now let's see what happens if we introduce a 10% income tax. Out of an increase of 100 million rand in income, the household must first pay 10% as income tax, leaving them with 90% of their income. Why? And of this, they're only going to spend 80%, their marginal propensity to consume, which leaves us now with an increase in consumption of only 72. In this chart, we can see the multiplier in effect. Before taxation, a rise in income of 100 increases consumption spending by 80, which boosts production and income by another 80, of which we spend 80%, so 64. And as the multiplier continues to push output and income, consumption spending then goes up by 51.2, then 40.96, and so on. But with a 10% income tax, consumption spending increases by only 72, and then by 51, then by 37, and so on. The multiplier changes from 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume to 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume times 1, less the tax rate. Our equilibrium level of income now changes from 1 over 1 minus C times autonomous spending to 1 over 1 minus C times 1 minus T times autonomous spending. This reinforces what really is just common sense. The introduction of income tax reduces the multiplier. Now, before we go on to calculate the multiplier, remember your rewind button. You can always go over whatever we've discussed here if you need to. Now, let's calculate the tax multiplier. Assume that our marginal propensity to consume is still 0.8, or 4/5 of our income. Income tax is now 25%, or 1/4 of our income. We know that the multiplier formula with taxation is now 1 over 1 minus C times 1 minus tax. If we insert our known propensity to consume and the tax rate into this equation, it becomes more concrete. Simplifying the tax multiplier, 1 minus 1/4 leaves 3/4, and multiplying this by the marginal propensity of 4/5 gives 12 over 20, and 1 minus 12 over 20, leaving 8 over 20. Now, 1 divided by this is the same as 20 over 8, so our multiplier, adjusted for tax, is 2.5. Now remember, before tax, a marginal propensity to consume of 0.8 gave us a multiplier of 5. A single increase in spending would yield an increase in income 5 times that amount. But introducing this income tax has halved the multiplier effect.
To summarise then, what happens when we introduce the government sector to our simple Keynesian model? Well, first, it introduces government spending.
Aggregate spending is now consumption spending plus investment plus government spending. Total spending increases, and with it, the equilibrium level of income. The amount of this rise in income is equal to the multiplier times government spending.
Secondly, an income tax is introduced. Now this decreases the value of the multiplier, since households now spend a smaller proportion of any rise in their income, and so the equilibrium level of income declines.
The formula for the equilibrium level of income now changes from 1 over 1 minus C times autonomous spending, where A bar comprised autonomous consumption, autonomous investment, plus autonomous government spending, to 1 over 1 minus C times 1 minus T, multiplied by autonomous spending.
Now that we have a basic understanding of how government can affect the goods market, let's look at how government can make use of its spending and taxation powers to influence the level of production and therefore the level of employment and unemployment in the economy.
Fiscal policy is the economic term for government policies on spending, taxation and borrowing, used to achieve particular economic goals. The main instrument of fiscal policy is the budget, which lays out the game plan and the main policy variables, the offence and defence on the field of government spending and taxation.
At the macroeconomic level, fiscal policy is one of the most important tools the government has to manage demand and generate economic stability. So to demonstrate the stabilization role of fiscal policy, let's consider the following.
In the following diagram, the goods market is in equilibrium at point E. Total spending is equal to the level of output and income. But at the moment, this is lower than the level of full employment. The economy is experiencing unemployment, and the cause of this unemployment is inadequate total spending. Under these circumstances, government can use fiscal policy to stimulate spending in an effort to increase production that creates employment.
Here, this can be achieved by an expansionary fiscal policy. Now, a fiscal policy is expansionary when it seeks to increase total spending, resulting in higher output and income. This can be achieved by increasing government spending or by reducing income tax, or both. First, let's consider the impact of increased government spending.
An increase in government spending means that government buys more goods and services from firms in the economy. It could be bricks for building, gravel for roads, sheets for hospital beds, or any number of things. Firms respond by increasing production. They employ more factors of production, so household income increases, and they increase their consumption spending. The multiplier kicks in, and the production is boosted even further than this, and income rises again. The multiplier is kicked in, and that initial injection of government spending stimulates a cycle of rising output and income. Now, we describe this as a chain of events. An increase in government spending, G, increases total spending, A, which boosts output and income, Y. The multiplier adds momentum, and the rise in output and income causes a rise in consumption spending. So total spending increases again, stimulating even more production and income. In our goods market diagram, the impact of an increase in government spending is presented as follows. An increase in government spending, which as we know is autonomous, pushes the vertical intercept, the A bar, upwards, and the total spending curve shifts. The market is no longer at equilibrium point E. The rise in total spending, the increased demand, stimulates production and income. And with the multiplier pushing it, the equilibrium level of income YE moves upwards until we reach the new equilibrium at E1. This process also creates jobs, and the market moves closer to a level of full employment.
Lower taxation implies that households have more disposable income, and this frees them up to increase their consumption spending, and therefore total spending in the market goes up. Firms respond by raising production levels, so using more factors of production, with the result that household income rises again, causing another round of increases in disposable income, consumption, total spending, and production. It's the multiplier effect at work all over again. In terms of an events chain, which shows what factors cause others to change, the impact of lower taxation can be described as follows.
Lower tax means people have more disposable income, so consumption spending rises, increasing total spending in the economy. Firms respond by producing more, and so income increases. Again, with the help of the multiplier, this generates more spending, output, and income. In our graph, taxation changes the slope of the total spending curve. A lower income tax results in a steeper slope, reflecting that households now spend a greater proportion of their income on consumption. At the original level of income and output, YE, households now spend a larger proportion of income, namely C multiplied by 1 minus T. Total spending exceeds output, inventories decline, and firms react by increasing production. This rise in output increases income, and households once again have more to spend. The multiplier is kicking in, and the market moves to the new equilibrium at E2 and Y2. A movement closer to full employment takes place, and unemployment decreases.
From this, we can see that an expansionary fiscal policy, such as increasing government spending or reducing taxation, can be used to increase total spending and the level of production and income in the economy. Now, this in turn reduces unemployment because higher production employs more labour.
Although we won't go into it here, we should point out that the opposite of an expansionary fiscal policy is called a contractionary fiscal policy. Markets, after prolonged periods of growth and stability, can become overconfident. People forget that everything is a cycle, and for every sunny day, a rainy one awaits. Typically, in any boom, households spend too much of their income, and firms overproduce in anticipation of continued growth in consumption. When in this state, a market collapse can be devastating. An alert government will see the signs and can use a contractionary fiscal policy, decreasing government spending, raising taxes to slow spending down, and bring markets down to a more sustainable level of production. Of course, it takes discipline and iron resolve to shut down such a party. The public rarely understands or appreciates such intervention, and neither do firms. But history shows that markets cannot always manage themselves, and fiscal policy can be the last remaining instrument of salvation.
Okay, let's use our circular flow model to see how the inclusion of imports and exports affects total spending, output, and income in this economy. Exports, which we denote with the letter X, are goods and services that are produced within the country but sold to the rest of the world. Now, spending on goods we export therefore comes from the rest of the world, the foreign sector, and for this reason, we refer to it as an injection into our circular flow of spending, output, and income.
This injection of income is of immense value to any country. So far, we've identified internal flows of income in our goods market between firms, households, and the government. But even with the help of the multiplier, there's a limit to the amount of income we can generate on our own within this market. There are a finite number of consumers and investors. But if we can open the model to the rest of the world, firms can start to attract spending from the foreign sector, firms and households from every other open economy in the world. Adding exports to our model requires our firms to employ more factors of production, generating more income for our households, allowing them to increase the consumer spending, and once again, sparking the multiplier into action. So, where we left off, total spending was made up of consumption spending plus investment spending, and also government spending. Injecting exports into our flow, total spending now equals C plus I plus G plus export spending X.
So, now that we've brought exports into our model, what about imports? Imports, represented by the letter Z, are goods produced by the rest of the world and purchased locally by us. They could be consumer goods, as well as capital and intermediate goods such as machinery or equipment. And since part of our spending now goes on goods produced by other countries, imports represent a leakage from our circular flow of spending, output, and income.
As we've seen, some imports like fuel are essential because we cannot produce enough locally. But what about the importing of goods and services for which there are locally produced alternatives? Well, if we spend more on imports, it implies that we're spending less on goods and services produced by our firms. In terms of our flow, consumption spending has declined, output and income decrease, and our circular flow of income contracts. Adding imports to our model indicates that total spending now equals C plus I plus G plus X minus imports, Z. That's the leakage from our circular flow. So, as a general rule, we can state that if exports increase while imports stay the same, then aggregate spending, output, and income will increase. But if, on the other hand, imports increase while exports stay the same, then the level aggregate spending, income, and output will fall in our economy. In 1996, the South African government demonstrated its commitment to open markets and creating a favourable investment climate. It introduced something called GEAR, the Growth, Employment and Redistribution Strategy. This neoliberal economic strategy contained policies to increase trade with the foreign sector and promote investment in the South African economy, and particularly foreign direct investment. The short-term goal was to achieve economic growth of up to 6% a year and create 500,000 new jobs as quickly as possible. The reasons for adopting this strategy were many and varied, but primarily, the government realised that to achieve a respectable quality of life for all our citizens would require much more income than our own internal markets could generate. The social and economic imbalances of the past were too great, and local market activity was too limited. Only consumption and investment from new global markets would boost local production to levels that would approach full employment and raise income to levels that would significantly reduce poverty. The results of this gear strategy have been mixed. It succeeded in creating some macroeconomic stability, but failed to create as much employment or income as had been hoped. But the principles behind the policy still seem to be sound. For most countries today, populations grow faster than local markets can expand. For most, it's only by embracing free trade, adopting sound, open economic policies, and achieving competitiveness in the global economy that they can hope to achieve health, wealth, productivity, and stability in an ever more complex world.
Well, good news on the finance front. Inflation continues to drop. Statistics South Africa has just released the latest consumer price index, and despite pressures from rising food and fuel prices, CPI dropped to 8% in May. The rate was at 8.4% in April. All eyes will now be on the Reserve Bank, which is expected to drop the repo rate by 50 basis points tomorrow. If it does that, it'll be a signal that Governor Tito Mboweni is putting the brakes on rate cuts, with inflation nearing the upper end of the bank's target range of 3 to 6%. Mboweni is under immense pressure from labor unions to lower rates after the economy fell into its first recession in 17 years.
Ik besta niet redelijk voor de inflation.
Jongen, ik is maar dom met zulke goed.
The 100 rand is nothing these days.
If I go and buy a packet of cigarettes that 2 years ago cost me $15, it now costs 22 rand, that's inflation. I feel that every day.
Je moet net zoveel meer geld uithalen om vir jou ietsie te gaan koop by die winkel of wat ook al.
Om elke tyd op te gaan moet alles. Ik bedoel, hier is kruis klaar, hoor. Maar ons moet nog oor die 3 rand tot 10 rand 'n brood betalen of so 'n brood betalen. En dit is verkeerd.
Inflation, it would seem, is a tricky concept. It has a momentum, an energy of its own. And when it's allowed to pick up speed, it can destroy whole economies.
We cannot have that big money. And I think the government messed up. And inflation, the zeros are still going to come up. Even you see today, the queues are all over at the bank, so you can't buy anything with that money.
If we're going to get to grips with it, we need to start somewhere. Perhaps with a commonly accepted definition. Inflation is defined as a continuous and considerable rise in prices in general. Now, this is what we call a neutral definition. It really tells us nothing about what causes inflation or how to tackle it. A causal definition of inflation might be something like this. Inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. This definition suggests that the cause of inflation is excess demand, combined with an oversupply of money. The first definition also refers to a rise in prices in general, as opposed to a rise in the price of one specific product. Now that's important. A rise in the price of one good or service on its own does not indicate inflation. We'll take Tandy, for example. 6 months ago, Tandy saw a bag that she really liked. But Tandy's a student, and the bag cost 2,500 rand. So she saved up for a while, hoping that in a few months she'd be able to afford it. Well, it took a bit longer than that, but here she is, 6 months later with the 2,500 rand. Unfortunately, she's going to be disappointed. The price has gone up to 3,000 rand. Now, can we say that Tandy's a victim of inflation?
The answer is no. We cannot call this inflation. But let's go back to the definition of inflation to see why. Now remember, inflation is a process of continuous and considerable rises in price in general. The increase in this case was only in the price of a handbag. We can't assume there was an increase in the price of other goods in general.
What Tandy has experienced is an increase in the selling price of one product. For all we know, this is just due to market forces, maybe increased demand for the product or because there's a shortage in supply. This is part of microeconomics, which we covered in the first half of the series, understanding demand, supply and prices for a single product, whether it's fried chicken or a bag. Inflation, however, is a macroeconomic concept looking at the market for all goods and services, the whole economy, the whole country.
Or in other words, inflation refers to a decrease in the general purchasing power of money, caused by an increase in the general price level.
But it also refers to a continuous rise in the general price level. Let's take Tandy, for example, where the price of her bag went up by 20%. Now, this is not an example of inflation. We can only identify inflation by a continuous, ongoing escalation of prices throughout the market. The last part of the definition we have to understand is that inflation refers to a considerable rise in prices. There must be significant price hikes over a period of time, not small percentages.
But how do we measure this percentage? How do we measure inflation? Well, since inflation is a continuous and considerable rise in prices in general.
To measure inflation, we use an index to measure the change of a general price level over time.
The most widely used measure of inflation is called the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. Now, this is the price index of a weighted and representative selection of consumer goods. And we economists sometimes refer to it as a basket of goods. Now, when we say weighted, we're not talking about that. It means that the goods from this selection that we spend the most on are given more importance, more weight. And representative implies a typical or common selection of products consumed by society, like bread, milk, and so on. Now, what a price index measures is the average price of a group of goods relative to a base year. That's a starting point in time. And the price index for the base year is always equal to 100.
To illustrate how it works, we'll create a simple price index for this gentleman, Joe Consumer. The following table details the goods and services that Joe consumed during 2008. The first column lists all the goods in the basket, some trousers, some bread, movie tickets, and some apples. Now, column 2 lists the price of these goods as they were in 2008, and in column 3, the price as it will be in 2009. Well, you can see the price of trousers increased by 20%, price of bread went up 40%, price of a movie ticket by 10%, and there was no change at all in the price of apples. The total price for the year of each good in the basket is the sum of all expenditure on that item, the quantity purchased multiplied by the price. Column 4 shows 2008 totals and column 5, 2009. Well, since Joe spends more on trousers, they have a higher weight. Any increase in the price of trousers will have a greater impact on the price of the whole basket. In 2008, the basket of goods cost Joe 970 rand in total. In 2009, the same basket cost him 1,168 rand. The base year is 2008, and the index value is therefore 100. To calculate Joe's price index for 2009, we simply divide the price of the whole basket in 2009 by the price as it was in 2008, and then multiply by 100 to get an index. 1,168 rand divided by 970 multiplied by 100 gives us a price index of 120 for 2009. As a percentage, with this basket of goods, Joe's rate of inflation is 20%. The same basket of goods cost him 20% more in 2009 than it cost in 2008.
There is distinctions to what appears in the basket and what does not. Stats SA believes that they cannot measure goods of high price value that not all South Africans can afford to buy. They cannot also measure the cheapest good that we all can afford to buy, but it's also not going to give impact to the basket. So what they have done is in 2000 and 2005, 2006, they had a survey which measured the income and expenditure patterns of South African households. That was called the Income and Expenditure Survey. And from the survey, they captured the goods of consumers, products that they buy and spend their money on. And from there, a list or a basket of goods is captured to put into the CPI. They choose very clearly to what they need to have the basket look like, so that it can be weighted accordingly as well, so that you get a true reflection of the measurement of the CPI at the end of the day.
Statistics South Africa compiled a new basket in 2008, and this table shows the different categories of products and, importantly, the weighting assigned to each. Food and non-alcoholic beverages get a weighting of 18.2, alcoholic beverages and tobacco 5.56, clothing and footwear 4.42, housing and utilities get a weighting of 21.04, household contents 6.14, health 1.48, transport 17.79, communications get 3.1, recreation and culture 3.93, education 2.15, restaurants and hotels 2.78, and a category called miscellaneous, that's all the other things we buy that are too diverse from household to categorise, make up the remaining 13.3% of our expenditure. As you can see, the highest weight goes to housing and utilities, which is as you'd expect. But this basket does actually reveal quite a lot more than that. If you take a closer look, it's a mirror that reflects modern society and lifestyle. As a society, for instance, we spend more on communication than we do on health and education. We spend a large percentage on transport, and booze and cigarettes are always near the top of the charts.
The year in which they conduct this research is referred to as the base year. And as you might imagine, it takes considerable time, manpower and resources to compile an accurate consumer price index. And for this reason, the base year only gets updated every 5 years or so.
A change in the consumer price index over the following years is compared to the price of the same basket of goods in the base year. The CPI is measured every month and is then used to calculate the inflation rate, which is the change in the index from one period to the next. The rate of inflation is usually calculated on an annual basis. Now, one way of doing it is to compare the consumer price indices for one particular month from one year to the next. Well, say you wanted to calculate the rate of inflation between December 2006 and December 2007. From the CPI, we get the following figures. The CPI in December 2006 was 137.8, and in December 2007 it was 150.2. So, to calculate the rate, subtract the December 2006 figure from the December 2007 figure and divide that total by the December 2006 figure. Multiplying the result by 100 gives us the month-on-month inflation rate. For December 2007, it was 8.9%. You can also calculate the inflation rate comparing the average indices for the whole year with a previous year. This method is more accurate.